Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be taking a look at two of the recent Natasha Denona palettes. We have the Xenon palette and the new Golden palette. So I have fair neutral skin tone with some cool overtones. So typically I tend to go for shades that are closer to neutral in the spectrum, but I prefer those that lean cool versus those that lean warm. Now these two palettes are kind of on the extreme. So we have the Golden palette, which is a very, very warm palette. And then we have the Xenon palette, which for the most part is very cool. You know, we have a lot of silvers, blacks, and those deep blues. So do these palettes that are at the extremes, are they really worth picking up? Let's take a look. We're going to start off by swatching the palettes, and then I do have several looks with each of the palettes, and then this look that's on right now is actually, it's a combination of both, but it's primarily the Golden palette. So we're going to swatch these side by side. So I'm going to, kind of not go all the way across the wrist so we have room for the Xenon. So this first shade here you can see is going to be kind of like a creamy matte, but it has a little bit of a golden hue. It's like an ivory golden hue, whereas this is going to be more of a shimmery peachy copper. Our next shade here is going to be another matte. This is the shade Panna, and this is going to be more peach. Now, even though it's peach, you can see we still have a little bit of a tannish undertone to it. And the next one here is going to be more of a khaki tan. So you can see that we've got some neutrals in here, but they all lean pretty warm. Fizzy here is going to be a sparkly, more of a coppery version. It's kind of a soft copper. And you can see it's just a little bit more coppery than the Nubia shade, the second shade that we swatched. Moving on to the second row, one of my favorite shades here is Varus. And this is a really beautiful, kind of a cocoa brown. This one's more neutral, and it's going to be a satin shade. Then we have Aura. Now, when I first got Aura, I swatched this several times because it looks more like a cooler white tone shade in the palette, but you can see it's actually going to be a soft gold. So I just used a very clean finger just so we have absolutely no contamination. And you can see that it really has that golden reflect there. So it's not actually a white, it's really more of a soft gold. Then we have the shade Teak, which is going to be a warm brown. This is going to be a matte shade. And you can see we have a little bit of an orangey reddish hue to it. Kava here is going to be another shimmer. And this one you can pat on to really get more of that sparkled starlight effect. And now this is like an actual gold. In the pan it looks a little bit more peachy, but it's definitely a gold on the skin. And then our last matte here is Sandstone. This is the last matte in the second row. And you can see that it is going to be a warm, softer brown. Moving on to the bottom row, we have the shade Aurum, which is going to be kind of an old gold. And then we have Log, which is a deep brown. And this shade is going to be cooler. You can see this one, though, is a little bit chalkier in texture. Sometimes that happens with the deeper pigments. Then we have the shade Oro, which is going to be your bright gold. And it actually has a little bit of a brassy hue to it. Then we have the shade Flesh, which is going to be a deeper peachy tan. And then our last shade is Alchemist, which again is going to be another gold. This time we have a bit of copper mixed in. So this here is the Golden palette from Natasha Denona. And you can see that the shades all run warm for the most part. They all have pretty much that yellow golden undertone to them, aside from a couple like Log and Varus, which is more neutral. But they're all going to run fairly warm. And some of the shades here, they look pretty similar on the eyes. So although we don't have any, exact dupes of the shades in the same palette, they are pretty similar. And as Natasha Denona, they've been very clear that some of these shades are repeats from other palettes. Now, before we move on to the Xenon palette swatches, just wanted to show you this palette here because we do have kind of a beveled top here. It kind of looks like, you know, fabric that has been loosely laid down. And it's very pretty. Other than that, we have the same type of packaging that we usually do. The pans are removable, so you can mix and match, but they do have the shade names labeled here. And we do have a magnetic closure. Now, the Xenon palette, this is going to be flat, and we have kind of like black with some scattered starlight, essentially. So you can see that this palette is going to run a bit cooler, but one thing that differentiates this from the Natasha Denona Golden palette is, although we have lots of silvers and blacks and blues, we also have a little bit of some pops of color, you know, some different shades here, such as this snowbow shade or snowbow, and then skipped here, which is going to be a brown. So, you know, not that we have a lot of pops of color in this palette, but we do have more than in the Golden palette. So let's go ahead and swatch these. Our first shade here is called Rhyme. And let's go ahead and put that directly next to the first shade in the Golden palette. And you can see that this one here is going to be a soft satin. And this is kind of like your milky, pearly white. So we actually don't really have any silver hue in that shade. It's really a very pure white with some shimmer. The next shade here, Cygnus, this is a beautiful charcoal gray with shimmer. Now, this makes a really gorgeous smoky eye. You can pair this with other shades. You can actually sheer this shade out as well. So it's pretty versatile. Then we have the shade Stellar. So Stellar is going to be a shimmer. You can see is a sparkly white, touch of silver in there. You can use this one to kind of pat on top of other colors to cool things off a little bit, or, you know, just to get kind of that scattered starlight effect. Next, we have a very soft matte gray shade, and there is a hint of like that grayish blue in there. This one here is called Blizzard, and it's not an overly cool gray, but it leans cool. Then we have Gruh, which is going to be kind of more of a medium tone shimmery gray. Now, as I mentioned, we do have lots of grays in this palette, but when you look at grays, a lot of times they have different undertones. Sometimes it's more purple, sometimes more brown, sometimes more blue. So some of these shades, you can see that this Gruh shade is actually going to be a little bit of a warmer, more steel gray than some of the other ones we're looking at. This is the first shade in the second row, and this is called Ebb. And you can see it's a really beautiful, not quite as deep as Midnight, more of a soft navy satin. Then we have the shade Supersonic, which is kind of like your pure silver shimmer. And then Sposh, this is going to be kind of more of a matte navy with a touch of a black base to this. Then we have Snowbow or Snowbow, and this is kind of a soft pink shimmer, but there is a little bit of a blue, not really an undertone in here, more of like a reflect. So you can see you do get a little bit of that blue hue there, which skews this to be a little bit cooler. I love this shade, whether it was in this palette or something else. I think this is like a very versatile pink shade. Then we have Night Sky, which is going to be your deep midnight blue. And this one here is going to be deep and rich. And although it kind of looks like a matte at first, it's actually a satin. Doesn't really have much shimmer in it, but it's smooth, it's creamy. First shade in the last row here is Contrail, which is going to be a matte. It's not a stark white, it's an ivory white, but it's still more white than ivory. And then we have a matte medium gray called Snart. And you can see this has a bit of a bluish undertone to it, so it's going to lean cool. Then we have the shade Nev, which is going to be another sparkly white shade here, but compared to our first shade here, you can see this one has a touch more, it's actually a touch more gray in here, a little bit more silver. And this one's a little bit more concentrated than the shade Stellar as well. So let me just show you those real quickly. So this is our first shade, Rhyme, which is going to be a little bit, I'd say it's a little bit more powdery, more chalky in formula in comparison. Whereas then we have Stellar, which is kind of your scattered starlight kind of shade, or you can build it up and get more of an intense sparkle. And then this one here is Nev, And you can see we've got a little bit more gray in there, and it's kind of in between those two formulas. It's very creamy. You can sheer it out and get more of a scattered starlight kind of shade, or you can pile it on to get more. Then we have a matte. This is more of it's a very soft grayish taupe. There's not enough brown in there to be a true taupe, but you can see it's kind of like a very soft French gray. And then our last shade here is a soft brown, which I really love. It's pretty sheer. You can really sheer this out, but you can see this is going to be a warmer shade. So it's brown. There's a little bit of a rosy hue to it. And this is going to be a shimmery shade that, again, you can sheer out and just get a little bit of sparkle. You can use this on top of some of the cooler shades to warm it up. You can blend it out with some things. And I think it's a very versatile shade. Let's go ahead and take a look at the demos and details for these palettes while we talk a little bit more about them. Now, just a few product details for both of the palettes. As I mentioned, the packaging is going to be similar for both. However, the Golden palette does have kind of that beveled top, kind of like a little bit of a wave. However, I do want to mention that it is not so dramatic that storing this palette becomes an issue. You can still stack this easily with like the Xenon palette even on top, and it doesn't get like rocky or bumpy or anything. So, you know, it's more of a subtle beveled look. So I think that's something important to note. A few other details. Both of these palettes retail for $69 US. We have 15 shades in each. And we have approximately between 18 and 19 grams for both palettes. There's the same volume of eyeshadow in each pan, but different formulas have different masses or different weights. So, you know, depending on how heavy that particular formula is, but you do have the same amount of product in each. We have a 2-year shelf life on these palettes, and they are made in Italy. One thing to note, the Golden palette does feel a little bit heavier in the hand than the Xenon palette due to the packaging. So it's just slightly heavier. So let's take a closer look at the Golden palette. And as you're looking at these demos here, I just wanted to do a variety of different looks using pretty much all of the shades in the palette. So that was kind of my goal there, just to kind of see how similar the eye looks can actually be when you're using very different shades in the palette. And you can see overall, yes, you can see some different nuances, but a lot of these shades are going to look fairly similar on the eyes, and you can kind of get like the same look in a lighter version and a deeper version and so forth. So do we really need 15 shades? Not really, but you know, if warm palettes are definitely something that you love, this might be one that you like. So just a few details from Natasha Denona. This is the new and elevated 15 shade version of the iconic gold palette in her signature formulas, designed to create mesmerizing golden hued looks. According to Natasha Denona, this palette combines versatile golden earthy hues and rich statement metallics in her pro-level user-friendly formulas, featuring brand new and existing shades that effortlessly complement all skin tones for an easy daytime glow or majestic evening glam. This midi-sized palette showcases 7 mattes in Natasha's famous cream and pressed powder finishes, 5 high-shine golden and vivid antique brass metallics, a nude champagne sparkling foiled formula, a chroma crystal topper with a diamond-like finish, and golden nude wet effect formula. Overall, my thoughts on this palette, I think this is a very nice palette for warm tones. I do like the palette overall. However, I do think that the shades, they're kind of repetitive. So we really only need like half of the shades in this palette to kind of get all of these looks. Another thing that I find lacking in this palette, I would have to say that, you know, for the most part, the mattes are her typical mattes, but the shade Aria, which is the second to last shade in the top row, that particular matte shade is a little patchy for me. So that one, it feels a little bit drier, and you kind of have to be careful to really kind of pat that one on. When you do a sweeping motion with that, you do get a little bit of patchiness. And even when I was just using finger swatches to create the reel that I made with this palette, you know, I was having trouble getting that one to be completely smooth. So that particular shade was a little problematic. It's not as noticeable on the eyes unless you're doing a full matte look, but if you're gonna cover it with one of the shimmers, it's really not an issue. Another con that I have for this particular palette is, as I mentioned, this palette really features your golden tones. You also have a lot of neutrals and browns in here, and these are all pretty much shades that we all have in our collections already. They're not really all that new or different. And I think that's totally fine for a big palette. I love neutral palettes and so forth. I even love like themed palettes like the gold palette. But what I am missing are a few pops of color. And I think that's what usually makes these bigger palettes more special, is the fact that you do have kind of that, you know, that theme. Like here we've got our gold theme, but it would have been nice to have, I personally, I'd like maybe 3 or 4 different shades, pops of color in there, maybe something with a different undertone to kind of cool things off a little bit. You know, Varus is pretty neutral, but it still leans warm. Would have liked to see, you know, maybe some things that are a little bit more true neutral or even a little cool in this palette. And that's what I think Xenon has for it that the golden palette doesn't, is it does have a few different hues like that pink shade and the brown shade. So it would have been nice to see something a little bit different in here, perhaps even like a duochrome shade that shifts from gold to silver, or you know, something just a little bit different. So I feel like this palette, it could have been a really great update for the original gold palette, but it does fall a little bit short because the shades are pretty repetitive. We don't have any nice pops. You know, there's no green like in the original gold. So overall, I think this palette just ended up being okay when it could have been, in my opinion, pretty great. That being said, it's still a nice palette. The quality is nice for pretty much all of the shades. Again, the only one I had issues with was that matte called Aria in the top row. But overall, it is still a nice palette, but it is going to be rather monochromatic. Now let's go ahead and move on to the Xenon palette and my thoughts on that. So we kind of went over the specs and details for that. I do have to say the packaging on this, you know, it's totally fine, but seeing it next to the golden palette, I do kind of prefer that particular packaging. I just think it looks a little bit nicer with that beveled top than what we have with the Xenon, which honestly just looks, you know, like computer printed. Now, as for the shades in the Xenon palette, as I mentioned, you know, pretty much all of the shades in here do have kind of a gray or a blue undertone to them. They're going to run pretty cool. And I do feel like, I don't know this for a fact, but I feel like the majority of skin tones in the world, we have more people that lean warm versus those that lean cool. There's definitely plenty of people with cool skin tones there as well, but there are fewer people who can kind of pull off those extreme cool eye looks compared to those that can pull off an extreme warm eye look. And because of that, this palette might seem like it's not going to work as well for as many people. However, what this palette does have going for it, as I mentioned, is we do have a few different pops of color in here that kind of help to kind of reach that difference. So we have some shades like the Snowbow and the Skift that, you know, Skift is actually going to be neutral, leaning a little warm. Snowbow is pretty neutral, leaning a little cool. And then we have our grays with slightly different undertones. Some of those grays are going to lean a little bit more brown, a little more neutral. And that means that people who do have those warmer undertones, not necessarily people with a very warm undertone, but if you do lean a little bit warmer, those are grays that you can pull off to still get that cool look. So in my opinion, regardless of the actual colors in the two palettes, that's the factor that really differentiates these two palettes apart, is the fact that the Xenon palette seems to cater a little bit more to different skin tones by incorporating some of those other shades and those pops. Makes this palette not quite so monochromatic. And we do have quite a few different hues. Yes, we've got our grays and light and medium and deep and so forth, but we also have slightly different undertones to them that are a little bit more dramatically different than the golden palette. So overall, between the two palettes, the Xenon is my preference for that reason. Now I have to say, with the formulas in the Xenon palette, I had no issues with any of the formulas in here. None of the mattes were patchy. They were all very smooth and easy to apply. All of the shimmers were great. You know, so absolutely no issues with this. I would have to say that the Xenon palette just, it's a little bit of a better palette than the Golden palette. So taking a look at both of the palettes, again, we have our Golden palette here versus our Xenon palette. And I have to say there are shades in both palettes that can be worn by a variety of people. So overall, they're both nice palettes, but my personal preference is going to be the Xenon because we do have a little bit more variation in that palette. Even though some of these cooler, you know, more extreme cool tone shades are still ones that don't necessarily suit me that well, just like there are some that are extremely warm and yellow, like Oro here, the Golden palette, that also don't suit me well. So let's go ahead and do just a couple of quick comparisons. We're not going to do a ton of comparisons because honestly, you know, the Golden palette, I feel like most people are going to have all of these shades somewhere in their collection. And the Xenon, you probably have, you know, I'm sure everybody's got a black somewhere in there. Are you going to have all of these shades? You know, you might, depending on what you purchase, but it's definitely going to be more common to see some of these more golden browns and gold hues. So let's take a few quick comparisons. This is Modern Glamour from Chanel, and I'm actually going to swatch these on my other arm so we can kind of compare these. And you can see that in this case, we have kind of your cool tone gray shades here as well. And they're going to be kind of similar in tone to those we have in the Xenon. So you can see they match up fairly well. So if you have a palette like that, or the Modern Glamour palette from Chanel already, it's going to be pretty similar. Another one I wanted to take a look at is the I Need a Nude from Natasha Denona. Now, this is going to be pretty different from the gold palette overall because we're looking at more yellow tones versus more of your warmer rosy tones. But I did want to swatch just a couple of them so you can kind of get an idea of, you know, how similar some of them can be. So this is the shade Ella, which is in the middle of the first row. And you can see how that kind of brown shade is kind of like a lighter version of Varus. We have the shade Muse, which is the middle of the palette here. And that one is actually going to be more similar to the Grift shade in the Xenon. We have Sheen down here at the bottom, which is going to be more of your peachy shade. That's going to be kind of similar to the Nubia shade or the Fizzy shade. It's kind of in between those. And then I also want to take a look at this pink one here called Mia down at the bottom and just see how that compares to the Snowbow. And you can see that the Mia is going to be more of a neutral pink. It's actually a little bit warmer, and we don't have that blue hue that we have in the Xenon. Now, I don't have the original gold palette from Natasha Denona, but I do have the mini gold. So let's go ahead. We're going to swatch this one, and we're going to swatch this one vertically here just to kind of keep it separated from the others. And you can see this bright gold here. You can see though that there's a little bit of kind of like a green reflect in there. And it's these kind of more greenish shades that we have in the palette that I think really make this a little bit more special. You can see we have those golden green reflects, and it's just a very different look overall than this more brighter yellow gold shade in the Golden palette. Now, even if you purchase something like this, the Chanel No. 5 palette that came out a few years ago, or I guess it's been a year and a half. This is like all shimmers that came out, mostly shimmers, for Chanel No. 5's anniversary. And you can see, you know, we're going to have shades that are similar to the gold palette, and yet we still have that black. So just, you know, even if you just buy kind of like a regular palette, you're going to get a lot of these same tones. They're not going to be that different on the eye. And then this is the Chanel Tweed Cuivre. And I wanted to go ahead and compare this. Now, this one actually has more like richer browns. And we don't have quite so much gold in here, but we do have some. So I wanted to kind of show you how that compares to the Natasha Denona Gold. Golden palette. I do feel like you get more dimension with this just because some of the undertones in here are a little bit, there's a bit more variation. 4 shades, but just a little bit more dimension overall from this palette. And then my last comparison, I just wanted to kind of give you another cool tone option. This is the Viev, the 90s palette. And I love this palette. These are going to be more of a powdery formula. Let's see, where can we squeeze this in? And, you know, I think I'm going to have to put this on the back of my arm. And you can see these are going to be a bit more powdery in formula. Let's see here. Where can we... We're actually, I think we're going to just squeeze them in vertically down here at the bottom after all. And we have these cooler tones in here, but we do also have some shades that have, a, you know, they've got a balance. So just another option if you're looking for something cooler in tone, but you feel like the Xenon runs a little bit too blue. We have more grayish hues in here with a little bit more of a brownish undertone for some of them. So this is, we even have some like neutral browns in here. We're going to go ahead and move up to the top now here so you can see the rest of this palette. But you can see that we have different tones. This one even has a little bit of purple. We have a burgundy here, and we have like kind of a deeper charcoal gray with a touch of brown. So if you're looking for a cool tone palette option that isn't as cool tone as Xenon, I think the Viev 90s palette is a really great one. It is definitely one of my favorite palettes. So I hope this has been helpful. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'd love to know your thoughts on these palettes. Please share them down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.